Hello and welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody. Welcome back to New Vegas, where today we're going to be taking a look at a cooking implement, I guess. Today we're going to be looking at the Cleaver and the unique version of it, the Chopper. So the Cleaver is an early game melee weapon that you'll probably find basically right at the very start. A lot of regular people can carry around the Cleaver, and a lot of powder gangers, for whatever reason, carry around the Cleaver as well. The Cleaver is, I guess, supposed to be a cooking tool, but it's been repurposed into a weapon, which... yeah, you could absolutely do that. I don't see a problem with that. For the base stats of the Cleaver, this one requires 0 melee weapons and 2 strength to wield, so any character can use this. Basically, everybody's going to be taking more than 2 strength regardless, unless you're doing a challenge run or something. But even then, you can actually get more strength than that. You could even just drink a beer and you'd have that +1 strength to wield the Cleaver effectively. Plus, if you're going to the melee build, you're probably going to be building a lot of strength since your damage can scale off of that. For damage, this one does a whopping 7 damage per hit, which isn't very high. This one does 18 damage per second though, because it does attack at least fairly fast, which is nice. This one has 7 crit damage, which again isn't very high because it's whatever its base damage is most of the time. This one has a 1x crit modifier, so average crits. This one costs 22 action points, which isn't super high. That's actually kind of low for an early game melee or unarmed build, which is kind of nice unless you get like brass knuckles or something. This one weighs 2 weight overall, and this one has a surprisingly high 250 item health. It takes a long time for the cleavers to actually break. That's really good. That's as high as like brass knuckles are, and brass knuckles are one of the best early game weapons too for a melee or an unarmed build. This one also does have a unique effect on it, similar to the machete that we talked about not too long ago. This one does 1.5 times extra limbs damage, so you can break limbs a little bit quicker with the Cleaver, which is actually pretty good early on, especially for a melee build. If you can break their legs, or if you can break their torso fast, then you can just keep smacking them and staggering the enemy. If you can break their legs, they can't move around as quick. If you can just break their arms, you can do more damage too, so all of that is pretty nice. And it makes it so the Cleaver is actually an okay early game weapon. For the general pros of the Cleaver, this one has really high item health, which is great. This one does decent damage per second. It's not really that high, but the unique ones is, so I figured it should be mentioned here. And this one does have the limb damage, so breaking limbs early on can actually save you quite a bit of hassle in the early game. For the general cons of this weapon though, the Cleaver does kind of fall off. It's not really that great compared to some other somewhat early game weapons like the shovel. I would say that one is better than this. And things like brass knuckles or spike knuckles, which you can also find fairly early on too. But at least this one can kind of compete with them since it has its own unique niche with the limb damage. It also doesn't have really high damage. That's sort of another con to this weapon. And if you wanted to like rush Chance's knife, then this one really doesn't have much of a purpose. But then realistically, like 90% of the other melee weapons don't really have that much of a niche either when you're just taking that into account. So assuming you're not doing that and you're just playing the game normally, the Cleaver is okay enough. For a general ranking on my tier list, I would put the Cleaver into C tier. It's not going to be anything crazy, it's not going to be anything spectacular, but in the early game, it can at least do some damage. And melee does kind of have the advantage of having really strong perks associated with it too. You can still stack things like Slayer, Super Slam, Piercing Strike, Purifier on top of this, if you want to have more damage towards basically anything, and that kind of carries melee weapons and unarmed weapons as a whole, and why there's so few really terrible melee or unarmed weapons in general. Let's talk about the unique version of the Cleaver now, that being called the Chopper. The Chopper you can find at Wolfhorn Ranch. This is actually Ulysses' camp, or Ulysses' home, in at least the canon. He's not actually there, but you can go into his house and take this. This is just found right on top of his stove, and this one does look a little bit different. It has a more rusted look or a more patinaed look to it than the standard Cleavers do, kind of surprising. It also has more of a arch, at least on the back part of the Cleaver. I actually really like the look of the Chopper, even though it's very simple. This one also requires 0 melee weapons and only 2 strength to wield, which is fantastic. This one does more damage, with it being 14 damage a hit, so it's still not super high. However, its damage per second is pretty high at 55 damage per second. This one actually attacks much faster than a regular Cleaver, so the damage per second is nothing to scoff at there. This one does 14 crit damage, so not super high there, but it has a 2x crit modifier, so you're more likely to hit crits. This one costs 22 action points, same as a regular Cleaver, which is still pretty good for a VATS build. This one also weighs 2 weight, still has the 250 item health, so it doesn't break very fast, and this one still has the 1.5 times extra limb damage, so you can break limbs even quicker with this one. This I would say is absolutely worth taking, and you can grab it pretty early on, especially if you just want to rush there, since you don't actually have to fight anything to get this. You just have to walk into the shack and grab it, and it's going to be on your way to do most of the quests in the normal game anyway, so you might find it completely by mistake. This one is totally worth getting in the early game because it is so dang strong, especially compared to regular cleavers, and since regular cleavers are so common in the early game, it's not going to be hard to repair this if you need to, because its item health is pretty good. We should also talk about the unique VATS attack too. I always forget to talk about that, but the unique VATS attack for the cleaver, for both cleavers, is the backslash attack. It's the same thing as the machete, and this makes so you do 70% less damage with that VATS attack, but it costs 5 less action points. So instead of costing 22, it would cost 17. That's okay. It's really not a amazing unique attack to have in VATS. The cleaver and the chopper also count as improved holdout weapons. I should mention that too. So if you have 50 sneak, you can sneak either of these into casinos or other areas, and the chopper can actually be pretty decent in those areas. It may not be as strong as certain other weapons we've already talked about on here, like the spike knuckles or love and hate. For an overall rating for the chopper, I'd actually put this one higher. I'd put this one into B tier. This one's actually a pretty decent melee weapon. It's not as good as certain melee weapons that you could get up to this point. Again, Chance's knife exists, but if we're counting that, then again, like 90% of the melee options just aren't as good as that, and that's not really fair. Compared to everything, it's actually a pretty good weapon. It's a pretty good melee weapon, and again, melee kind of carries itself thanks to all the perks that it has. So should you use the cleaver and the chopper? The cleaver, maybe. It's okay enough at the start, but if you're not doing a melee weapons build, then maybe you don't want to take it. And if you have like the broad machete at the start, you may just want to skip it anyway, because you'll probably use that up until it breaks. And then the chopper, I would recommend. It's pretty decent. Again, it's not going to be a top tier melee weapon, but it's going to be pretty decent. And if you want to keep it as a holdout weapon, it's also pretty good. Tell me your thoughts on the cleaver and the chopper down in the comments below, and tell me what other weapons you would like to see in this series. I think up next we're going to be taking a look at the hunting shotgun, because that one's been requested quite a bit recently. And then we're probably going to be taking a look at the 9mm. But after that, feel free to leave whatever other weapons you would like to see, because we've got plenty more to talk about in New Vegas. Thank you guys so very much for watching this. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I will talk to you guys next time. Bye-bye, everybody.